The story of Ernest Shackleton and the Endurance Expedition is remembered as one of the most remarkable demonstrations of survival and leadership in human history. It began in 1914, during the final years of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. When the South Pole had already been reached by Roald Amundsen and Robert Falcon Scott, Shackleton, an ambitious explorer who had previously come within 97 miles of the pole, dreamed of achieving what no man had ever done, a complete crossing of Antarctica from coast to coast. His plan was bold, dangerous, and filled with uncertainty, but Shackleton was known for his fearless determination. He gathered a crew of 27 men, all selected not only for their skills but for their endurance, loyalty, and ability to withstand hardship. Shackleton believed survival in such harsh conditions depended as much on character as it did on experience. The ship chosen for this monumental journey was the Endurance, a three-masted wooden vessel built in Norway. It was specifically designed to resist the crushing force of polar ice, its hull reinforced with thick beams of oak. Shackleton trusted it to carry them into the frozen heart of the Weddell Sea. The expedition set sail in August 1914. Just as the First World War erupted in Europe, Shackleton offered to turn the ship back to support his country. But the British government urged him to proceed. Believing his mission of exploration would inspire national pride during a time of crisis, by late 1914, the Endurance had reached the whaling station on South Georgia Island, the last outpost of civilization before plunging into the desolate Antarctic seas. Whalers warned Shackleton of unusually thick pack ice in the Weddell Sea, but he pressed onward, driven by ambition. At first, the ship advanced slowly through the ice, but by January 1915, progress halted completely. The Endurance was trapped in a prison of shifting floes, frozen solid, and at the mercy of the drifting currents. Shackleton and his men suddenly faced the reality that they might not set foot on the continent at all. Their expedition had turned from exploration into a fight for survival. The Antarctic environment was merciless. Temperatures plunged well below freezing, and the sun disappeared for months during the long polar night. The men established a routine to maintain discipline and morale. Shackleton insisted on regular meals, shared duties, and even organized games and entertainment on the ice. He knew that despair could be as deadly as hunger or frostbite. They hunted seals and penguins to supplement dwindling rations and kept their sled dogs alive as long as possible, though eventually they too would be sacrificed for food. For months, the Endurance drifted with the ice, groaning as the frozen pressure squeezed her timbers. The men watched helplessly as cracks spread across the hull. On October 27, 1915, the ship finally gave way. With ice crushing her sides, Shackleton ordered the crew to abandon ship. They salvaged what they could: lifeboats, supplies, tools, and camped on the ice while their vessels slowly slipped beneath the frozen sea. The dream of crossing Antarctica had ended, replaced by the desperate struggle simply to live. Now stranded on drifting ice with no contact with the outside world, the men endured month after month of freezing winds, storms, and starvation. They dragged their lifeboats across the floes in hopes of reaching open water. Nights were filled with fear as the ice cracked and groaned beneath them, threatening to split apart and swallow their camp. Shackleton moved constantly among his crew, encouraging them, setting an example of resilience, and refusing to let hope die. His ability to maintain morale under such hopeless circumstances became the defining feature of his leadership. By April 1916, the ice began to break apart, forcing Shackleton to make a desperate move. Ordered the men into the 3 small lifeboats, salvaged from the Endurance. For a week, they battled freezing seas, icy spray, and towering waves. Their bodies frozen and exhausted as they rowed toward the nearest land. Finally, they reached Elephant Island, a barren, uninhabited rock battered by storms. For the first time in 497 days, they stood on solid ground, but their situation was still dire. Elephant Island offered no real hope of survival or rescue. Shackleton knew he had no choice but to risk everything. With 5 volunteers, he prepared 1 lifeboat, the James Caird, for a nearly impossible voyage. Their destination was South Georgia Island, more than 800 miles away across the stormiest seas in the world. Shackleton left the rest of the crew on Elephant Island, promising to return. For 2 weeks, he and his small team endured relentless gales, freezing spray, and waves as high as houses. Navigation was nearly impossible, but through sheer willpower and skill, they reached South Georgia. They landed on the wrong side of the island, forcing Shackleton and 2 men to cross its uncharted mountains and glaciers on foot with nothing but rope and an axe. After 36 hours of non-stop climbing, they staggered into the whaling station at Stromness, ragged, starving, and barely alive. Shackleton wasted no time organizing rescue attempts for the men left behind. It took several months and multiple failures. But he finally secured a ship and returned to Elephant Island in August 1916. Against all odds, every one of his men was alive. Not a single life had been lost in the nearly 2 years since the Endurance was first trapped. On October 13, 1972, a small aircraft carrying 45 people, including a Uruguayan rugby team, their friends and family, lifted off from Montevideo bound for Santiago, Chile. Spirits were high, as the group was looking forward to both competition and adventure. But as the plane flew over the Andes Mountains, a region notorious for its unpredictable weather and jagged peaks, everything changed in an instant. A navigational error brought the aircraft too low, and in poor visibility, it struck a mountain ridge. The fuselage ripped apart, and the plane crashed high in the snowbound wilderness, shattering into pieces. 12 people were killed instantly, and many more were left critically injured, trapped in one of the most remote and hostile environments on Earth. The survivors quickly realized the gravity of their situation. They were stranded at an altitude of more than 11,000 feet, surrounded by towering peaks and endless snowfields. The air was thin, temperatures plunged well below freezing, and their clothing was entirely unsuited for the conditions. Worse still, food was almost non-existent. They managed to gather what little the crash had left them: some chocolate bars, a few bottles of wine, and scraps of luggage that offered no sustenance. Dividing these rations among more than 30 survivors meant that hunger began gnawing at them from the very first day. Rescue seemed uncertain. Though they held out hope that search teams would arrive quickly, reality struck within days. News crackled through the small aircraft radio they had managed to keep working. The search had been called off after 8 days, with authorities believing no one could have survived in such brutal conditions. The realization that no help was coming was devastating, but it hardened their resolve. If they were going to live, they would have to find a way themselves. The conditions tested them relentlessly. Many of the injured struggled to survive as infections spread and medical supplies were non-existent. They tore strips of seat fabric to make bandages and melted snow and pieces of metal to drink. The thin mountain air left them gasping, and nights brought freezing winds that penetrated the wreckage of the plane where they had taken shelter. Every day was a battle against cold, starvation, and despair. But hunger was their greatest enemy. Within days, their meager rations were gone. They chewed on leather, drank melted snow, and tried to fool their bodies into believing they were not starving. Eventually, faced with the unthinkable, they made the most painful decision of their lives. To survive, they would have to eat the flesh of those who had died in the crash. It was not a choice made easily or lightly, but rather in desperation, after endless discussions and prayers. With no other food available in that barren, icy wasteland, they understood it was their only chance. It was a decision that tested their faith, their morality, and their humanity. But it gave them the strength to endure. As weeks turned into months, their situation worsened. Avalanches swept through their camp, killing more of their friends and burying their fragile hopes. Under snow, each tragedy added to their despair, but the survivors clung to life with remarkable resilience. They built crude sunglasses from plastic to protect their eyes from snow blindness, and they fashioned sleeping bags from seat covers to fight the cold. Slowly, they began to realize that waiting for rescue was futile. If they were to live, someone would have to leave the wreckage and cross the Andes on foot to find help. In December, after more than 2 months trapped in the mountains, two young Menando Parado and Roberto Canes volunteered for the impossible journey. Weak, malnourished, and frostbitten, they prepared as best they could, carrying scraps of insulation for warmth and small amounts of food. They set out on December 12th, climbing from the crash site into the towering peaks that surrounded them. For 10 agonizing days, they trekked across glaciers, snowfields, and rocky slopes, enduring blizzards and freezing nights without shelter. At times, it seemed they would collapse and never rise again, yet somehow, driven by sheer determination and the knowledge that their friends' lives depended on them, they pressed forward. Finally, after 10 days of unimaginable hardship, they stumbled out of the mountains into the Chilean lowlands, where they encountered a group of local herders. Exhausted, barely able to speak, they explained their ordeal and begged for help. Word spread quickly, and within days, helicopters were dispatched to the crash site. On December 22nd, 72 days after the plane had gone down, rescuers arrived at the wreckage. 14 men were still alive, clinging to life after more than 2 months in the frozen wilderness. The world was stunned by their survival and by the extraordinary endurance that had carried them through one of the most harrowing ordeals in history. Their story shocked and inspired, a testament to the will to live against all odds, and a reminder of what human beings are capable of when faced with the edge of existence. In the summer of 1941, the German army launched Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union. Among the many targets of Hitler's forces was Leningrad, the second largest city of the Soviet Union and a vital industrial and cultural hub. Leningrad, formerly known as St. Petersburg, was not only a city of factories and shipyards, but also a symbol of Russian history and pride. Capturing it would deal a devastating blow to Soviet morale. But Hitler's strategy was not merely to conquer it. He ordered that the city be surrounded and starved into submission, its people left to die rather than surrender. What followed was one of the longest and most brutal sieges in human history, lasting 872 days. In September 1941, German and Finnish forces encircled the city, cutting off nearly all land routes. Supplies that once sustained more than 3 million civilians vanished overnight. The once bustling city, known for its culture and beauty, was transformed into a frozen prison. Food reserves quickly dwindled, and what little remained was rationed to the bare minimum. At first, citizens received small portions of bread, but as the weeks wore on, the rations shrank further. By the winter of 1941-42, adults were reduced to just 125 grams of bread per day, less than a single slice. Even that bread was not made entirely of flour, but often mixed with sawdust, cellulose, and other fillers to make it stretch further. Hunger became a relentless torment. People searched for anything that could be eaten: rats, glue, wallpaper, paste, even leather boiled into soup. Starvation claimed thousands each day, their bodies left frozen on the streets, too many for families to bury. As food disappeared, some turned to desperate acts, and stories of cannibalism began to circulate. Yet, even amid such desperation, many tried to maintain a sense of dignity, sharing what little they had with neighbors, or refusing to abandon their loved ones. The cold was as merciless as hunger. The winter of 1941-42 was one of the harshest on record, with temperatures plummeting below -30 degrees Celsius. With electricity cut and fuel supplies exhausted, homes turned into ice chambers. Families huddled together under blankets, burning furniture and books for warmth. Water pipes froze, forcing residents to break through ice on rivers and canals to collect water, often under artillery fire. The sound of shells and bombs became a constant backdrop to life in the city, as German artillery and aircraft relentlessly pounded Leningrad, targeting both factories and civilians. Despite unimaginable suffering, the spirit of resistance endured. Factories, even under bombardment, continued producing weapons and ammunition. Workers, often starving themselves, labored tirelessly to supply the Soviet front lines. Artists, musicians, and teachers also refused to let the cultural heart of Leningrad die. In August 1942, at the height of the siege, Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, written in defiance of the invaders, was performed in the city. Musicians, many on the verge of collapse from hunger, gathered their strength to play. The performance was broadcast throughout the city and even transmitted by loudspeakers toward German lines. A message that Leningrad would never surrender. Survival. During the siege depended not only on resilience but also on the road of life, the only tenuous supply route into the city. During winter, when Lake Ladoga froze, trucks drove across the ice under constant threat of German attack. This dangerous path brought in small amounts of food and supplies and carried out evacuees. Mostly children, though never enough to feed the starving city. Drivers risked their lives daily, as thin ice often cracked beneath the weight of their vehicles, plunging them into freezing water. Yet without this lifeline, the city would have perished much sooner. As the months turned to years, the toll was staggering. By the time the siege was lifted in January 1944, more than 1 million civilians were dead, most from starvation and cold. Entire families vanished, neighborhoods were hollowed out, and the once grand city was scarred by war and loss. But those who endured carried with them a story of survival that defied the intentions of the enemy. The siege of Leningrad remains one of the most devastating events of the Second World War. A chapter in history marked by suffering beyond measure, but also by resilience, solidarity, and the refusal of a people to be broken. Even as death surrounded them, the citizens of Leningrad clung to life, to culture, and to hope. Enduring nearly 900 days in conditions almost beyond imagination. In April 1970, the Apollo 13 mission lifted off from Kennedy Space Center in Florida, its goal to become the third successful lunar landing of NASA's Apollo program. The crew consisted of Commander Jim Lovell, Command Module Pilot Jack Swigert, and Lunar Module Pilot Fred Hayes. Lovell was a veteran astronaut who had flown on Gemini and Apollo missions before. But for Swigert and Hayes, this was their first time heading into deep space. The mission began with optimism, as America had already achieved 2 moon landings, and public interest was waning. Apollo 13 was meant to continue the momentum of lunar exploration, but instead it became one of the greatest survival stories in human history. The launch on April 11th went smoothly, and the spacecraft quickly set course for the moon. For the first 2 days, everything appeared routine. The astronauts conducted system checks, transmitted television broadcasts to Earth, and settled into the rhythm of space travel. But on April 13th, about 200,000 miles from Earth, the mission took a dramatic and nearly fatal turn. A routine request from Mission Control for the crew to stir the oxygen tanks in the service module triggered a disaster. At 9:08 p.m. spacecraft time, an oxygen tank exploded with a violent bang that shook the entire ship. Lights flickered, alarms blared, and the spacecraft shuddered. Inside the capsule, the crew felt the explosion immediately. First, they thought they had been struck by a meteorite, but the reality was even worse. One of the oxygen tanks had completely ruptured, destroying critical systems and causing the second tank to leak rapidly. Oxygen was vital, not just for breathing, but also for generating electricity and water through the ship's fuel cells. With the tanks damaged, the main power source was failing. The spacecraft, designed to sustain life for a lunar landing mission, was now crippled and unable to continue. Lovell calmly reported the words that would become iconic. "Houston, we've had a problem." The situation quickly became a life-or-death struggle. With oxygen leaking and power dwindling, the crew abandoned plans to land on the moon and focused entirely on survival. The lunar module, originally meant to support 2 men for about 2 days on the moon's surface, was hastily converted into a lifeboat for all 3 astronauts. NASA engineers on the ground scrambled to devise solutions while the astronauts improvised with limited resources to keep themselves alive. Life inside the lunar module was far from comfortable. Temperatures dropped as power was conserved, turning the cabin into a freezing environment. Condensation formed on every surface, soaking equipment and clothing. Astronauts shivered in their suits, rationing every ounce of water and every crumb of food. They had to be careful with waste as well, because the fragile systems could easily be overwhelmed. Fatigue set in as the crew endured sleepless nights, their breath visible in the icy air, while uncertainty about their fate hung over every moment. One of the most urgent problems was the buildup of carbon dioxide. The lunar module's life support system was not designed to handle 3 men for such a long period, and the scrubbers that filtered out carbon dioxide were quickly becoming overwhelmed. Without a solution, the crew would suffocate even before they ran out of oxygen. In Houston, engineers worked feverishly to create a solution with only the materials available on board. They came up with an improvised adapter to fit the square filters from the command module into the round openings of the lunar module. Using plastic bags, cardboard, tape, and socks, the astronauts followed instructions from Earth to build the device. It worked, saving their lives by allowing them to breathe safely. Navigation was another monumental challenge. With much of the spacecraft's power gone, they could not rely on their usual guidance systems. Instead, they used the Earth itself as a point of reference, conducting manual course corrections to keep their trajectory on target. Every burn of the engines had to be precise, using only the small amount of fuel remaining. Any mistake could have sent them drifting into deep space or crashing into the moon. Lovell's calm leadership and Swiggert's steady piloting skills proved essential in executing these delicate maneuvers. Back on Earth, the world watched anxiously. News of the explosion spread quickly, and millions followed the updates from NASA. The astronauts' families waited in agony, unsure if they would ever see their loved ones again. For days, the fate of Apollo 13 hung in the balance. A reminder that space exploration was still filled with unknown dangers, despite the triumphs of Apollo 11 and 12. After 4 tense days, the crew finally approached Earth. Re-entry posed its own dangers. The heat shield, damaged systems, and improvised solutions all created uncertainty. The world held its breath as Apollo 13 entered the atmosphere, radio contact cut off during the fiery descent. Minutes passed in silence until finally, parachutes were spotted in the sky. The capsule splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean on April 17, 1970. The crew was exhausted, shaken, and weakened, but alive. Apollo 13 never reached the moon, but it achieved something far greater. It demonstrated the resilience, ingenuity, and courage of both the astronauts and the NASA teams on Earth. What began as a near-certain death sentence was transformed into a story of survival that inspired the world. While it proved that, even in the cold silence of space, human determination could find a way forward. In the early 20th century, Antarctica was still one of the last great frontiers left, unconquered by explorers. The race to the South Pole had already been won by Roald Amundsen in 1911. And Ernest Shackleton, an Anglo-Irish explorer, sought to achieve a new milestone, the first crossing of the Antarctic continent from sea to sea via the pole. In 1914, Shackleton launched what became known as the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition, a daring and ambitious journey into the most hostile environment on Earth. What followed was not the triumphant crossing he had envisioned, but one of the most extraordinary survival stories in human history. The expedition set sail aboard the ship Endurance, a 3-masted vessel specially designed to withstand Antarctic ice. Shackleton's crew of 27 men, along with 69 dogs and supplies for years, departed from South Georgia Island in December 1914. Spirits were high as they set course for the Weddell Sea, the launching point for the planned continental crossing. However, almost immediately, nature proved its dominance over human ambition. By January 1915, the Endurance became trapped in pack ice, just a day's sail from their intended landing site. Shackleton and his men soon realized they would not reach the continent as planned. At first, the crew remained hopeful that shifting currents would eventually release the ship. But weeks turned into months, and the Endurance remained locked in the ice. The men adapted to life on a frozen prison, turning the deck into a kennel for their dogs and building routines to keep morale steady. Shackleton knew that discipline and optimism were just as important for survival as food and shelter, so he enforced strict schedules of work, exercise, and even games to prevent despair. As the Antarctic winter descended, the ice around them grew thicker and more violent. Pressure ridges, great walls of ice created by colliding floes, formed and creaked ominously around the ship. The crew listened to the groans of the Endurance as the crushing ice began to squeeze her timbers. On October 27, 1915, after nearly 10 months trapped, the ship could take no more. The hull cracked and splintered. Water poured in, and Shackleton gave the order to abandon ship. The men salvaged supplies, lifeboats, and anything useful before watching their ship sink beneath the ice. Their dream of exploration was over. Now, survival was their only mission. Stranded on the ice floes of the Weddell Sea, hundreds of miles from the nearest inhabited land, the men faced a seemingly hopeless situation. With no way to send a message and no hope of rescue, they had to rely entirely on themselves. Shackleton moved the men into makeshift camps on the ice, living in tents, and surviving on meager rations, supplemented by hunting seals and penguins. The dogs, once intended for hauling sledges, became a source of meat when food ran short. Every decision was agonizing, but Shackleton's leadership never wavered. His priority was always the safety of his men, and he made sure to keep their spirits alive with constant encouragement. As months passed, the ice floes drifted northward, slowly carrying the men closer to open water. Finally, in April 1916, the floes began to break apart, and Shackleton ordered the men into the 3 small lifeboats they had saved from the Endurance. The journey that followed was a test of endurance in the truest sense. For 7 days, the men battled freezing spray, towering waves, and exhaustion as they rode through the treacherous Southern Ocean. When they finally sighted Landalofen Island, it was a moment of overwhelming relief. But their struggle was far from over. Elephant Island was uninhabited, a barren, windswept rock, offering little more than shelter from the sea. Shackleton knew they could not survive there indefinitely. Their only hope lay in reaching South Georgia Island, 800 miles away, where whaling stations offered the possibility of rescue. Taking one of the lifeboats, the James Caird, Shackleton selected 5 men to accompany him on what would become one of the greatest small boat journeys ever attempted. With little more than a sextant for navigation, they set off across one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean in the world. The voyage of the James Caird lasted 16 days. Shackleton and his crew endured storms, freezing spray that turned the boat into a block of ice, and near exhaustion. Navigating by fleeting glimpses of the sun through storm clouds, they somehow managed to stay on course. On May 10, 1916, battered and frostbitten, they reached South Georgia Island. Yet their ordeal was not finished. They landed on the uninhabited southern coast, the mountains and glaciers separating them from the whaling stations on the northern shore, in one final display of determination. Shackleton and 2 companions set out on foot across the icy, unmapped mountains. For 36 hours straight, without sleep, they climbed and descended glaciers, crossed frozen valleys, and risked falls into crevasses. When they finally staggered into the whaling station at Stromness, the workers could hardly believe that these gaunt, frostbitten men were survivors from the lost Endurance. Shackleton immediately began planning the rescue of the men left behind. It took 4 attempts and several months. Sea ice repeatedly blocked the way, but Shackleton never gave up. On August 30th, 1916, more than a year and a half after the Endurance was trapped, Shackleton returned to Elephant Island and rescued every one of his men. Not a single life had been lost. The Endurance expedition was supposed to be a tale of conquest, but it became instead a story of leadership, resilience, and survival against impossible odds. Shackleton's ability to keep his men united and alive in one of the harshest environments on Earth turned what could have been a tragedy into one of the most extraordinary survival stories ever recorded.